Committee on Standards in Public Life. The Committee on Standards in Public Life advises the Prime Minister and the government of the day on processes and systems to uphold high public standards across public life in the UK. On the occasion of our 25th anniversary, which was in 2019, we undertook some academic work to look at the tapestry of standards bodies that exist and have been built up over recent years to monitor public standards. And our current inquiry, building on that, is to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the system as it currently exists and to make any recommendations for improvement and to identify areas of best practice. We will be live streaming this evidence through YouTube, and we are very pleased to have with us as our witness in this session Lord O'Donnell, who is a former Cabinet Secretary. And I would just like to point out for those who are not familiar with our work that we are not looking at specific cases, and we are not looking specifically at any of cases that are currently before the courts, but we will be wanting to understand the systems that exist and where there might be the scope for improvement. We have for this session both the independent members and some of the political members of the committee. So we're joined by Dame Shirley Pearce, Dr. Jane Martin and Manisha Shah, who are independent members. We have Jeremy Wright MP, Dame Margaret Beckett MP, and Lord Stunnell, who are political members of the committee. So if I can just commence with the questions, Lord O'Donnell, thank you very much. At the time that you finished as Cabinet Secretary, you did a broadcast on BBC called In Defence of Bureaucracy. How important are the 7 principles, the Nolan principles, to the functioning of our bureaucracy, and do they provide the government with the right ethical underpinnings?
Right, good question, and thank you very much for inviting me to give evidence to such a distinguished committee, and I'm really pleased you're looking at this subject. And I'm very proud of that lecture on in Defence of Bureaucracy, but it was mainly aimed at public servants and bureaucratic systems, actually partly in public and private sectors. I think the 7 principles, as you say, are very, very important for public life. And they were released, of course, during my time when I was with John Major when he was Prime Minister. I think there is an issue. It's a very, very, Sir Humphrey in me wants to say brave or even courageous to be trying to get principles which cover the whole of public life. And I spent my time with the civil service, and we had the honesty, objectivity, integrity, and impartiality, which was fine and worked, I think, perfectly well. And I had the openness and accountability there, fine, and leadership. Trying to cover elected officials with the same set of principles is an interesting thing to try and do. And obviously, at one level, one can say they're exactly the same. At another level, we're talking about very different kinds of people doing very different kinds of jobs. The politicians in front of us are basically people who put themselves forward for election. That's quite hard if you think about trying to get yourself selected as an MP and going about what you have to do for that. And the selflessness part would be slightly, you're there to push yourself to be the person who can beat the other person. So there are slightly different incentive structures. There's completely different structures in terms of things like appraisals, objectives, and all the rest of it. So it's quite a struggle to put something which encompasses everything. And I think we need to understand there are different incentive structures and different procedures within the civil service and the wider public service than there are within politics.
So, turning to the question of politicians, to what extent do you think within a democracy that there needs to be a separate set of standards that politicians are living up to, as distinct from the fact that they are ultimately accountable to their electors and that they therefore face elections periodically? And is that really the thing that needs to be seen as being the constraint on them?
No, and let me be clear about this. I think the standards happily apply, but the question is, it's a slightly more subtle one. What are the incentive structures for making people comply with those standards?
And your answer to that?
Well, well, it's partly elections. It's partly politicians understanding that trust in politicians is hugely important for them delivering their job. So I think you do need to think, though, within those structures and within the system they're operating, it's rather different to, you need to use different techniques to get the right standards. And you need to be thinking possibly quite often more about transparency and accountability. And those standards being maintained by the fear of what the media will say or what the opposition will say. Whereas in the civil service, it wouldn't be about what the media will say, and there's no opposition. It will be about what your line manager says. And therefore, you need to think much more carefully about processes of management within the public sector. But for politicians, there's a different structure.
And do you think that the arrangements that we will talk in more detail about, the Ministerial Code, etc., later on, but do you think in general that we have the right arrangements in place in terms of accountability and transparency to ensure that those constraints or incentives are effective in the British system today?
Well, I think that's really, how would you judge that? And I think I judge that by outcomes. And I think if you look at the sort of long-term trend, and I know you've asked this question about, are things getting better or not? I think the long-term trend is upwards, and I think that's been helped by transparency and accountability, but there are definitely cycles around that trend. And I think there are some things where in the past, I remember working with various prime ministers mostly as cabinet secretary, and you would be absolutely paranoid about your prime minister misleading parliament and ministers telling the truth all the time. And yet now we see things happening where it appears that ministers are saying things to me which is just not true. Saying there's no border in the Irish Sea on St. Patrick's Day seems a good example to give. It clearly, patently is a border in the Irish Sea. There are other examples where ministers going off-piste and saying things that just seem not to be compatible with the government's position. Ministers having to be held to account by people like Michael Howard on their own side for things they're doing in terms of suggesting that the law should be broken. So I think there are some areas where some of the traditional standards have fallen away. But in general, I'd say the trend is towards better government.
Because last year, you said trust in government and the trust in integrity of government is being tried very hard. Are those the sort of issues that you had in mind when you made that comment?
Most certainly, because I think there's a real issue when we know that trust in government is hugely important. And actually, I think I put that in a paper about COVID response. Trust matters a lot. And if you go by simply those opinion poll data on, how much do people trust ministers? We've had, I don't know if it's still the case, but there was certainly recently a record gap between trust in ministers and trust in civil servants. That's not good. That's not a place we need to be. So something is going wrong in that way.
Would you like to venture a thought on what it is that's going wrong?
Well, I think it's this point about telling the truth and people believing that what ministers say is actually true. And we find that, that used to be such a cardinal thing that, if you misled Parliament, it was the end. And that seems to have changed somewhat.
What do you think of the long-term consequences for the UK and for Britain if there is that lack of belief that the truth is being sort of articulated by ministers? Is this something that we should worry about across wide sort of front? Has it got wider implications rather than merely a sort of narrow political implication?
Yes, I mean, the economist in me says you really do have to worry a lot about the public sector now, not least because the public sector is about to get much bigger. It is, we're looking at record levels of public spending as a share of GDP. So how the public sector operates is very important. And what you find is if a source turns out not to be very trusted, then people go to other sources, and quite often those other sources are even worse. And we see this, about, let's say, is the Oxford vaccine safe or not? And you're seeing lots of misinformation. You're seeing political games there, I say it, across EU nations being played. And I think that's very worrying. And then people start to think about, okay, if I can't trust them, where should I get reliable, objective information from? And then, of course, you're onto the internet, and that can be a bit of a wild west.
I'm going to hand over to Jane Martin.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and good afternoon, Lord O'Donnell. I'd like to ask your opinion on how standards are being upheld currently by the government. I mean, clearly there has been a lot of public concern recently. Indeed, that continues. We know there have been extraordinary circumstances in play. But can I just put the broad question to you, first of all, given the systems, etc., how effectively are they being upheld by this current government?
Well, I think you'll see where there are problems, and I would kind of sniff them out by looking at resignations. When you see Alex Allen resigning, what's going on there when we have an independent advisor who makes a clear finding about a breach of the Ministerial Code, and then the Prime Minister doesn't accept it. I mean, that puts you in a bad position, and it puts you in a very bad position because you had two former independent advisors give you evidence, both highly respected individuals. Who's going to take this job now? What is the point of being an independent advisor when your advice isn't going to be listened to and can just be thrown out, and you have no power to instigate investigations? So you kind of get into a catch-22. Anyone would accept that job is clearly not an appropriate person to have it. So that is a real problem. So I think we do have some issues about standards, I'm afraid.
And sure, and we will come on to the Ministerial Code in more detail just a little later, if that's okay with you. So, I mean, just to embellish that a little, you talked about, resignations, and, obviously there have been other people who, for different reasons, have left senior roles. I mean, clearly the Alex Allen one has caused a lot of public concern. Are there any, other? Do you think that is an illustration of a wider concerns? I mean, you're close to these things. You work right at the heart of government. What's your take on it, more broadly?
Yeah, I would also point to the Jonathan Jones case, where, there you have a highly respected individual, really worried about the way in which ministers are behaving and the way in which that's led government to behave. And that worries me, so I do genuinely think, I would suppose another indicator of where you think things would be going badly wrong would be looking at the number of directions that government is making. Nothing wrong with
Ministerial directions.
Ministerial. Yeah, sorry. This is where the civil servant feels obliged to say, actually, Minister, I will only do this if you give me a written direction. That's a kind of nuclear thing, which I never had to do. And I think, all of these things are best kept unused because you advise the minister it's not a good idea. And there are certainly occasions when it's absolutely right for a minister to say, yes, I think it's right that you seek a direction and we should do it. Douglas Hurd of the Pergal Dam was a classic example where I think Douglas was absolutely right to basically say, for political reasons, I think this is the right thing to do. And Tim Lancaster, as a civil servant concerned, was right to say, well, I'll need a direction for that. So there is a place for these, but they have been growing quite substantially, and that does make me very nervous.
And you've already highlighted, the differences in your view between, the sort of regulating official conduct, shall we say, and then of course the political issues. Do you think any of this is linked to, you've said you don't think it's a trend, you've used the word cycles, but do you think any of this is about because we're in a more polarized political climate?
Well, that's what I'd say about cycles. I mean, are we trending towards more polarization? I'm not sure. I would want to look at evidence for that, and I think we don't have enough to say that there is a trend in that direction. And you can't yet tell the difference between trends and cycles, but certainly that there have been polarizing events. I mean, Brexit would be an obvious example. But as we come through that in a post-Brexit world, one would like to think that we might move away from that polarization. I think it's certainly true to say, well, in the presence of someone as distinguished as Margaret Beckett, I couldn't possibly comment on this, but when you think of where the Labour Party is now versus where it was a while ago, are we having a slight move towards a more traditional Labour position? Let's put it that way.
Sure. And in the same vein, what about leadership in maintaining values and norms? Thinking, of course, of our current experiences, but I mean, you have experience of a number of, senior roles and prime ministers. How important is leadership, both official and political, in helping to ensure standards are properly upheld?
It's absolutely crucial because, people will only listen to the message if they trust the messenger. And, if you say do X, but you actually behave in a different way, then people won't pay much attention to you. And I think this is where it really behoves all of us in Parliament to be quite careful about what we say, because it's really important for us to get our own standards in place. I think I think all of us in the Lords would be kind of slightly nervous about being in a situation where we think we're too big. I worry about some of the expenses scandals there have been. I think we need to make sure that we're in a situation where we can be trusted, and that's really important for us.
And so you seem to be making that point quite across the board, really. I mean, in terms of leadership, it's not just, as it were, those at the top, although no, I imagine.
That's right. I always just say to civil servants, I'd ask them, for people across a whole range of grades, who are the leaders in the room, and some of them will put their hands up, and I'd say, well, that's wrong. You're all leaders. You've all got leadership roles to play. You are all looked upon by your colleagues in some way or another as leading, and so it's really important that people understand that it's their job to live the life. When I looked at and revised the Civil Service Code, we had this ridiculous code where I think the first sentence was over 100 words long, and it had a footnote to clarify some of them. I mean, it was ridiculous. You need to live these things. The code needs to be something that people can read and understand. And actually now we actually even ask people, have they read the code or not? So we've got real data and evidence to be able to establish whether people know what's being asked of them.
And just finally for me on the same point, I mean, leadership, I'm just interested in sort of pressing a bit on political leadership, because I understand the point you've made, but from a public point of view, they're not privy to the way in which the civil service, operates in the way that you or indeed I might be. So, the public are looking at our leaders, aren't they? And so, I guess it's particularly important there. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'd be interested in your view.
Again, this comes back to the point I made right at the beginning. There are two different sides to this, public servants and public leaders. And the difference is elected officials go out of their way and have to be public public leaders. And they're there in the media and all the rest of it. And most civil servants, never ever see the light of day. And that's probably fine by everybody. But for political leaders, yes, it's absolutely crucial that they show leadership. They show the kinds of behaviours that they want all of their ministers to do. Hence the importance of collective cabinet responsibility, for example. And that's another issue at times you kind of see that disappearing. You see people, I mean, I was reading what Jacob Rees-Mogg said about the Belfast Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. It seemed to be completely different to what I thought the government's position was. But nobody seems to pay much attention these days to these sorts of things. So I do worry that, yes, political leaders have to be, role models for the standards they want all of their other ministers to obey, and they want to show to the public that they are living by.
Thank you very much. I think Dame Shirley is next. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lord O'Donnell. You've talked a bit about some of the things that you think are going wrong, or examples of where things have gone wrong. And I'm keen to understand a bit more about why, so that we can help make recommendations about improving that. And much of our approach to upholding ethics in government seems to depend on individuals following unwritten conventions, what's sort of been talked about as the good chap theory, rather than enforcement through formal roles. I mean, do you think we've got that balance right, or does that need rethinking?
Yeah, well, I certainly don't like the language that my good friend Peter Hennessy has brought into this, because that's not for this era. It's wrong in all sorts of ways. So should we require people to always interpret things in the right ways? Well, I think this comes back to the kind of rules versus conventions and the whole, I'm very much in favor of having principles-based approaches to these things. If you look at Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, it was about establishing principles. It wasn't, and then they can be interpreted. I think if you try and do a whole list of rules, well, first of all, they or indeed put them in legislation, they're very rigid. Mark said, well, in our previous evidence, talking about the US Constitution, where they have millions of rules and, very detailed constitution, but still there can be conventions about, how one reacts. His example, I think, was a very good one of how one reacts to losing an election. We still rely on certain conventions as well. So for me, it's about that balance of establish certain principles, because the principles are likely to be longer lasting and allow you to be more dynamic in the way you apply them, because situations change and the world we operate in changes because of developments in technology and the like. So I think it is absolutely crucial that we have an agreement about what the core principles that we live by are, and then some dynamism about how best to achieve those and what kind of feedback systems to have in place to make sure that if you're going wrong and you're interpreting in the wrong way, then you're called out and you've got a chance to improve.
And so are there particular areas where we aren't articulating the principles well enough, which we should be focusing on first? And what do you do if the principles aren't then followed?
Yeah, well, I would say the principle about telling the truth is a hugely important principle. The principle about not misleading. I sometimes weep at the use of statistics, and I know that ONS must weep about the use of statistics. And again, this isn't picking on any one party in particular, but there have been some egregious uses of statistics to mislead or simply being misinterpreted. So I think those sorts of things are hugely important. So trying to get trust in what people say is essentially what it comes down to. They can make whatever decisions they are, but they should be based on a kind of a common understanding of what the fact base is.
Yes. So what I'm trying to understand is if we haven't got, if the principles are there, and it seems, we have got some principles, if they aren't being followed, people are not telling the truth. What needs to be in place in the regulatory system around it to just calling it out, as you're suggesting, doesn't seem to be cutting the mustard at the minute.
No, that's right. And I would say that really worries me. There's like lots now of fact checkers and all the rest of it, and they don't get as much attention as I think they should. So, and the media has a role in this, and the opposition have a role in keeping the government of the day honest. So I think all of those things there, but I think there are certain things we can do, like we can make sure that there's some transparency and openness around. So I would give possibly more power to the national statisticians, all of those kind of watchdog areas, to call out things where people have said, you misused statistics or misled the public by making claims which are just not true.
It's quite challenging to see how that might happen in practice in a consistent fashion, and I suppose that's what lends people to thinking there should be clearer rules with enforcement sanctions. But I'm just very interested if there are particular angles and things that you would hope that we as CSPL might recommend to address this, that we really know what you're thinking.
Yeah, well, I mean, the one thing I would say is, with a lot of statements, it's very hard in a lot of politics to say what's right and what's not. But I think those areas where you're dealing with factual things which can be checked and statistics, that's where I would say there really needs to be a much stronger emphasis on someone calling these things out, and then a requirement, just as we have in press regulation, that if someone's got it wrong, the paper then has to print a correction. Yeah. And I would like, ministers, if they do mislead the House, to be going back to the House to say, I need to tell you that when I said X, actually that wasn't true.
That's really helpful, thank you. I'm going to hand on to Margaret Beckett. Thank you.
Margaret, you're on mute.
I do beg your pardon. I want to take you back for a moment to the question of more of the civil service, because you said a moment ago the whole idea of CRAG, of the Act, was to put the principles, establish the core principles, but it could be very rigid. So that was done in your time. Has it been effective? In what way has the civil service behaviour changed since that Act was put in place?
Well, right, very good point. I mean, the CRAG, remember, as a legislature, was something which affected both civil servants and ministers, and it established certain principles. I think it was there mainly to deter future problems that might arise, particularly with moving towards moving away from impartiality in the civil service and allowing ministers actually to choose whoever they wanted, for example, in a position without any regard to competence and the like. Now, what that imposed in some cases, and this is quite a good example, I think, was, there's a procedure, let's say, for picking a new permanent secretary, where there are various applicants, and you end up with a number of applicants who are what we call above the line, who are appointable, but you're clear about who the best person is in your view, and number two. And I think that principle has been established by CRAG, and that's there, and that's adhered to. Part of the problem, though, is I think Francis Moore was very keen on doing this, that we abolished the idea that you would take the best person, and now ministers are free to choose anyone as long as they've got above the line, and that to me is a worry, and can lead to some substandard appointments, in my view. So yes, I think the CRAG has helped, and it stopped movements toward politicization of the civil service. It's necessary, but it may not be sufficient, to use a phrase that Mark used.
So if you were drafting it today, are there things you'd do differently? Things you would change?
I'm not sure, because to be honest, I do think legislation has a relatively limited role in all of this. I think CRAG took us a very long time to get through. If you remember, there were commitments to this through many, many decades, I think, that we might actually establish these principles. in law, and various cabinet secretaries tried, and I was the one that got lucky. And if you remember, and I would say it's lucky because it was done in wash up. It wasn't, it was because we got to the end of a parliament and everyone said, oh, okay, you can have it. So I think I'm glad we got it, and I would be nervous about reopening it because it might just as easily go backwards as forwards.
Yeah, one thing that struck me forcibly listening to you and the emphasis you put, which to me is very welcome, on truth and on the proper treatment of statistics and so on. This is slightly off-piste, but what worries me sometimes is that there seems to be a tendency in some quarters to think that truth is the same thing as what you personally believe, that somebody is being honest if what they're saying is what you either thought was true or what you would like to be true.
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. And that's why I'm quite careful about the way I describe this, because some people would say, well, that's not true because it's not something that they believe in. And to be honest, in the political sphere, you come into politics because you have very strong beliefs.
That's right.
And therefore, the fact that you disagree with each other is actually, to my mind, quite healthy. And that's part of a working democratic system. So I don't feel that's a problem. I do feel that if someone says that there are 8 out of 10 of this, and when there are actually only 4 out of 10, that to my mind needs to be called out. But honest disagreements, because people think differently and have different ideologies, absolutely, that's what politics should be about.
Thank you.
Let's move on then to Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Lord O'Donnell. Can I ask you a little bit about the architecture for standards regulation? And we've talked a little bit about CRAG. Obviously, part of CRAG was to set up the Civil Service Commission as a statutory body. But as you will recognise, there are a large number of other bodies in this space that are not statutory. Whether we're talking about the independent advisor who's already been mentioned, or ACABA, or the House of Lords Appointment Commission for that matter. Is it your judgment that we would benefit from those bodies which are not statutory becoming statutory, or are there advantages in your view to them not being statutory bodies?
I'd start by saying what really matters is what's going to deliver good outcomes. And by good outcomes, I mean what's going to deter bad behaviour and ideally reward good behaviour. And that differs in the different cases of the things that you mentioned. And I'm not sure the answer is really whether they're statutory or not. I'd say it's more about what their policy remit is and how they go about it. So if you take something like ACABA, right? I might as well get this off my chest. All of us who've been subject to ACABA are really fed up with it, mostly. It's just doesn't seem to get it, really. I mean, my own experience, and I was being incredibly careful to obey the rules, obviously, was that I ended up being told off because I'd got a visiting professorship at LSE with a pay level of 0 somehow was an issue. I mean, and it wasn't an issue, it's just that I hadn't ticked some box somewhere. And yet you see other egregious things going on where people have moved from one role to another role very quickly, sometimes from a ministerial role to a private sector role, and you think, well, what is this? So if there's something that needs to be sorted out, it will be the way these bodies operate. And I would look at them all and say, are they delivering good outcomes? Do people think they're doing a good job? And if not, then how could they best deliver that job? And to be honest, it's not so much about whether they're statutory or not statutory. I wouldn't get obsessed with that. I'd say, how are they set up? What's the policy? What's the remit? What kind of people we got involved, And yes, there are some issues about powers as well. Don't think
sorry to interrupt you. That's what I was going to ask you next, because as you say, that there are issues around judgments, there are issues around whether or not these bodies are coming to the right conclusions. But then there's a secondary question, which is, if they are coming to the right conclusions and they conclude that bad behaviour is taking place, what can they actually do about it? And I suppose one of the questions we might put to you is whether or not, whether we should obsess over statutory or non-statutory. The question of enforcement becomes very relevant for bodies that don't have a statutory underpinning, doesn't it?
Yes, I totally agree with that. And I would say that comes into my evaluate how good the body is by looking at the outcomes it produces. And in order to do that, you need to deter bad outcomes, and therefore you need sanctions. No question about that. And, you know, often the sanctions, I mean, first of all, if you're going to have strong sanctions, then you need to have a body which actually has the trust and, you know, that people believe is fair. And that's quite important. If you had a body with strong powers that people thought was just completely arbitrary, that would be a real problem. But I think if you set up the body well, then you should, if it's to deliver its job, then I think it needs to have some powers to have sanctions, most certainly.
Very much. That's all I had. Handing to Manisha next.
Manisha Shah.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Lord O'Donnell.
Good afternoon.
I had some questions for you on the Ministerial Code, and I will try and keep them brief. But how successful, in your view, is the Ministerial Code and the independent advisor in regulating ministerial conduct? You've touched upon it briefly before, but it'd be really useful to have a proper, fuller answer.
I've kind of got a personal attachment to the Ministerial Code because of, I think Alex mentioned this QPM, Questions of Procedure to Ministers, which we, when I was Press Secretary to John Major, we finally published. I think that was a really huge step forward. Became the Ministerial Code. I think the Ministerial Code is a good thing. I think it has to be owned by the Prime Minister, and each Prime Minister should look at it and decide. And that's the power of it, really. This is the Prime Minister saying how ministers should behave. It's not some bureaucrat, civil servant saying this is what it should be. It's the Prime Minister. And if the Prime Minister says this is how ministers should behave, it's the Ministerial Code, he's signed it off, then presumably this should have really strong power and should be adhered to. I'm very strongly of the view that the independent advisor should have the power to investigate allegations about breaches of the Ministerial Code. I don't think they should wait for the Prime Minister to give them that. But I am also very strongly of the view that this is the Prime Minister's code, and that when findings, which in general should be published, when those findings are out there, the Prime Minister should decide on the sanctions, and that those sanctions, I think, should be graduated. You know, the idea that somehow got out there that if you breach the Ministerial Code, then the minister has to resign, I think is completely wrong. I think if you breach the Ministerial Code, there's all sorts of ways you can breach the Ministerial Code. There can be really, really serious ones, and they can be relatively minor. And so I think the Prime Minister has to have the ability to say, to have a range of different sanctions that they would impose, of which, of course, requiring resignation would be one.
Thank you. May I push you a little? I accept your answers on all of that, which we've been extremely clear. So thank you. Do you believe that it has been successful?
Gosh, you know, can we have a parallel world where there isn't a Ministerial Code? And then I could tell you, it's incredibly hard to do that. What I would say is that during my time, and I'm afraid that's now somewhat dated, I certainly used the argument frequently with ministers, with prime ministers, that the Ministerial Code said this, and to be honest, this was particularly powerful with prime ministers, because I wouldn't say the Ministerial Code says this. I would say your Ministerial Code, you wrote, says this, and now you're not, you know, this would not be living up to it, or X isn't living up to it. I think that's the power of it. Whereas for other ministers are saying, well, this is really annoying, it's ministerial code. But then you have to say, well, that's what the Prime Minister's decided, and that's where we are.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to answer quite a direct question. So thank you. I have a few more minutes, and I wondered if I may just step back to the cabinet manual that you touched upon briefly earlier. And we know that through the drafting of it, you said you sought to codify some of the conventions and norms around the standards of government. Do you believe that codification has meant that those conventions are followed more rigorously, more tightly?
Right, and I think remember the first source of this, Gordon Brown asked me as Cabinet Secretary to do it, and we produced one draft chapter before the 2010 election, which was essentially about the conduct of of hung parliaments, basically, unclear results, and did establish certain conventions like the Prime Minister remains the Prime Minister until such time as he goes to the palace and advises the Queen to put someone else to make someone else Prime Minister. That did its job in a sense that everyone, there was clarity about what the rules were. I have to say, all of the politicians of all the parties behaved incredibly well during that period. And, we had a very smooth transition in 5 days, which I think is a testament to all of the political parties involved. So I think the Cabinet Manual, just that one draft chapter in existence proved useful. But actually, as it was developed under David Cameron, it did, I think it was quite a good discipline, and it showed us what the conventions are. I pointed that it wasn't as big as Hague said in Parliament about consulting Parliament about before going to war. Really important factor, and we wanted to put that into the Cabinet Manual, but we didn't in the end. I wanted it to be updated, and I'm very pleased that Mark said that he wished he had, and I wish he had too, but I realised he had lots of other things on his plate, so I'm not criticising him at all. But I think it's important it's brought up to date, and I think we've observed, during the whole Brexit period, I think some of the things where we all thought there were certain conventions about the way the House operates, and then the Speaker would make some decisions which kind of brought all that into question. I think those things are very difficult, and in the work that we did on the Cabinet Manual, it kind of struck me that I suppose a kind of evidence-based approach. I kept asking this question to lawyers: when does something become a convention? How many times does it have to be used? And of course, there were no clear answers, and it's a very, very grey area. Which of these conventions really stands up, and what's behind them? So I think if the Cabinet Manual could lay them all out, and there could be some kind of understanding about which of these ones everyone wants to live by, and which of these ones that we want to say, well, actually, that's a really stupid convention, and when it's not appropriate for today, and that we think that should be thrown out. I think that would be a very healthy debate to have.
May I just, in a final question, may I ask, in that case, will the opposite also be true in terms of, this idea of building trust, etc.? Do some conventions and norms, rather than merely just being written up, actually need to be translated into rules, do you think?
I think if there were, if Parliament looked at them and said, this convention is pretty timeless, and is one that we would like to have under all circumstances, and you could get a big cross-party agreement, then I think those sorts of things would be sensible. But you see, I mean, a good example would be Fixed Term Parliaments Act. We had a convention that Prime Minister chooses, convention that I think gives too much power to an incumbent Prime Minister, but it's just my view. the law was changed, but now I think there's cross-party support. Both manifestos of the parties said, actually, we think we should repeal the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. So there are some things where it's not clear, but if there are things where there's strong view that this is actually how it should be, then I think there's a lot to be said for having that debate about turning a convention into a law. Most certainly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. That's all from me.
Lord Stonell.
Good afternoon. Good to meet you again. Not all the parties are in favour of repealing the Fixed Term Parliament Act. I'll just put that on the record.
Apologies, that's right.
Can I turn to the question of special advisors and ask you how successful the current arrangements for regulating their conduct is?
Yeah, I think this comes back to my point about trying to see that there's a difference between the political world and the public service, civil service world. Special advisors are not going in as special advisors to train to be really good civil servants. They're going in to mostly learn about how to be good politicians. And it's very different. So I think the rules for special advisors are quite aligned with the civil service ones, apart from the impartiality one. But I think there is still a problem, I think, and I say this as someone, there are lots of people who are kind of very anti-special advisors. I think good special advisors are worth their weight in gold. I've worked with some really good special advisors, and if I were to pick just two from across different parties, it would be, Ed Balls in the Treasury, Rupert Harrison when he was in the Treasury, and the Conservatives. There are plenty of very good Lib Dem special advisors during the coalition period. That they can work really well and be very helpful to both the civil service and the ministers. Bad special advisors, and which unfortunately we've seen quite a few over the period, are lethal to their ministers, right? It's the minister that loses out in the end, and they're bad for the system. Now, has the code stopped there being bad special advisors? Clearly not. And I think I would work quite hard to think about how can we find a way to help special advisors. I think Mark made the point that a lot of us had tried to do, which was there's really no support for special advisors. They come in, they don't have the management structures. There's a minister who works closely with them, but the minister has millions of things to do. They can't manage and coach and help a special advisor in the way that I would expect a civil service manager to coach people working for them. So I think we need to help special advisors, and we need to help them both in terms of their career structure, their development, but also the way in which they operate with regard to standards. Because I think too often we've seen special advisors who think that they can, not tell the truth, and again, that gets everybody in trouble, and actually it gets the special advisor in trouble, but fundamentally it weakens the minister.
So should all this be in the hands of ministers, or should there be an independent regulatory system which applies to special advisors?
I find it hard to see you get an independent regulatory system there where this is a responsibility of ministers. If you're able to come up with some really smart ideas that would work for this, that would work within what I must admit is a very political part of our system, I think you'd be doing an amazing job. But I certainly have been able to think of anything which would operate in that way. I think what we could do is provide more help to special advisors, more structure. I think there are real problems with special advisors who think that their allegiance is entirely to their Secretary of State and not to the government. And that can create all sorts of problems. We've seen special advisors, Dominic Cummings would be a classic when he was working in education, ended up not working in education because it was deemed that he was working not for the government, and the Prime Minister was not happy with that. So, you know, I think you do see examples where the structures aren't right. I think more of a structure for special advisors, more of a system of some kind of hierarchy where they had somewhere to go, which wasn't their minister, would be quite useful as well.
Well, they did. They did, didn't they? Because they all reported to Dominic Cummings, just mentioned. I mean, if I can just push you a little bit on this, I mean, you've analysed the problem. You said ministers are far too busy to fulfil it, and then you've said a regulatory system doesn't work because it's too political. So, could you just help the committee a little bit further on how we might tackle this particular conundrum, which is, after all, very much in the public's headlights, perhaps for the first time ever?
Yes. What you could do is have a, as it were, chief special advisor, sometimes called chief of staff in number 10, who would have rather more control over special advisors. Now, that control would need to be in a sense of managerial advice, support. I think what you observe with the Dominic Cummings episode is, I think a lot of special advisors within the system would say that control was rather more do as I say, don't you know, wasn't as benign as it might be. Let's put it that way. I'm thinking of something which I think Jonathan Powell talked about, Ed Llewellyn. You know, there are a number of people in number 10 who genuinely felt they had a role in trying to help a set of special advisors work together as a team. I think too often special advisors think of their team as simply their Secretary of State, not the government. And that could be done by strengthening the role of special advisors at the centre and having more of a hierarchy amongst special advisors.
Okay. Just to finish off, at the minute, ministers have got the sole responsibility for the standards of their special advisors. And does that mean that ethics has become completely subordinated to politics?
No. There have been occasions where, well, this is one example where I think, special advisors do need to be brought within the system somewhat more. So if you get an example of a special advisor bullying other people, bullying civil servants, let's say, then I think it's the role of the senior civil servants to call that out. And there's certainly been occasions where I have spoken to ministers about behaving badly, and quite often been told, "You're absolutely right, Gus, could you go and sort it out?" Which is slightly tricky because you're not their boss. But I think that there is a role for senior civil servants to say, look, you're not, you know, this is not the right way to behave. This is unacceptable. And if you carry on like this, you know, there will be consequences. And I think we cannot let special advisors get away with bullying other civil servants and just think that that's something that's part of the political domain and is allowed. I mean, just like we wouldn't accept ministers bullying civil servants. So, you know, I think there is a role here for there to be the ability to investigate special advisors in the way that Ministerial Code allows for investigations of ministers, and particularly on HR issues, for those things to be published, their findings to be published.
Thank you very much.
What they do.
Well, Donald, thank you very much indeed for your time and the help that you provided for this inquiry. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions.